Good afternoon. You're watching the news at 1. In the headlines, all eyes on Parliament, where Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan will deliver his budget speech in just under an hour's time. We go live to Parliament as we build up to the budget 2013. Also making headlines, Northwest MEC China Dodovu expected back in court for a bail application, and an emotional Pope Benedict bids farewell at his last general audience. These and other stories coming up. First, Faith has your main news headlines.
Thanks, Nompu. Good afternoon. Day 2 of Jonathan Davids' bail application in the Anine Boyson rape and murder case got off to a slow start. The police officer who spoke to the teen before she died was the first to take the stand in the Bredasdorp Magistrates Court this morning. Jolene Olivier says she spoke to Anine through a paramedic and a cell phone as she was in too much pain. But she could hear the questions Olivier was asking. She says Anine was certain that Zwei and 5 or 6 of his friends were responsible for her injuries. Asked whether she knew Zwei, she said yes. Yesterday, Davids told the court that his arrest was a case of mistaken identity, as there was another Zwei who lived in Zwelitsha. But while Olivier gave her testimony, she said Boysons described Zwei and said he was a close family friend. The case continues. The court proceedings in the bail application of murder accused Northwest MEC China Dodovu and 7 other suspects have just got underway in the Klerksdorp Magistrates Court. They're accused of killing ANC regional official Ubuti Chika just before December's Mangaung conference. 7 were arrested last week, while Dodovu was arrested by the Hawks in Potchefstroom on Monday. Hundreds have been gathering outside the court since early this morning. One group is calling for bail to be denied, while the other is supporting the accused. The accused's legal representatives say they are ready to proceed today, but the prosecution wants a postponement until Monday. The sentencing of bus driver Sisa Nonama started but was postponed in the Cape Town Regional Court. Nonama has pleaded guilty to 23 counts of culpable homicide after the bus he was driving lost control. The accident happened nearly 3 years ago near De Doorns in the Hex River Valley in the Western Cape. The bus was travelling from Luhamka en route to Cape Town from the Eastern Cape. Nonama admitted to driving the bus at 80 kilometers an hour down the pass. The bus rolled down an embankment in heavy rain. Today he testified in mitigation of sentence that he did not have the required Code 10 license. He said that he is sorry for killing so many people. The case resumes on the 26th of March. Hundreds of foreign nationals residing in Port Elizabeth have picketed outside the Home Affairs offices over the closure of the work permit office in the province. They apparently received letters alerting them that the offices will be closed from tomorrow and their work permits will not be renewed. This is the only office in the Eastern Cape where foreign nationals can apply for asylum. Hundreds queue here every morning to renew their work permits. Some of them say they cannot afford to travel to other provinces to renew them. The Department of Home Affairs says they'll continue to provide services, but no new applications will be accepted. Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan will make his much-anticipated budget speech in Parliament this afternoon. Speculation has been rife about the minister's speech. Civil society, economists and opposition parties will all be keeping a close watch.
It's one of the toughest budgets for the finance minister. In this subdued economic environment, tax revenues are depleting. But the minister needs to find the money for government to meet its social obligations and support the economy. Where will he get the money from?
We are looking to the possibility that the minister might have to increase certain tax levels. We are really hoping that he does not do this, because this, in our view, will really be an obstacle to economic growth figures.
Business wants a surprise-free budget with no tax shocks. It says with no negative impact on the economy, it can do its best to create jobs. Others want more flesh on the National Development Plan, which is aimed at creating 11 million jobs by 2030.
The National Development Plan is probably the best news we have had in a long time, but it's now all about implementation, and we haven't heard enough in Sona about that. We would like him to say a little bit more how he's going to implement that.
International ratings agencies will be watching closely. 3 of them have already downgraded the country's credit ratings because of debt management. The finance minister must be mindful of not running a large budget deficit. Abra Barbia, SABC News, Parliament.
And more on the build-up on Budget 2013 later in the programme. A huge crowd has gathered at St. Peter's Square in Rome to bid farewell to Pope Benedict the day before he becomes the first pontiff in about 6 centuries to step down. He will hold his last general audience. Many streamed into the square. The Vatican said Benedict will assume the title of Pope Emeritus and be addressed as Your Holiness. He will lay aside the red shoes of the fishermen that have been part of his papal attire and wear brown loafers given to him by shoemakers during a trip to Leon, Mexico last year. He will wear a simple white cassock. His lead seal and his ring of office, known as the Ring of the Fisherman, will be destroyed according to church rules, just as if he had died. In sports news, Orlando Pirates have failed to return to the summit of the ABSA Premiership table after going down to Morocco Swallows. That's after the Dube Birds overcame a 2-goal deficit to win the Soweto Derby 3-2 at the Dobsonville Stadium last night. In the other match, SuperSport United came out tops in the Tshwane battle after defeating University of Pretoria 1-0.
Pirates started like the house on fire when Tekshwa Chinyama's pass fell into the path of Sifiso Mieni, who coolly slotted home. Swallows gave away a penalty in the 36th minute, when defender Roger da Costa was unfortunately judged to have handled in the penalty box. And Ilajali made no mistake from the spot. But Swallows' revival began in the second half. Dikang Mawalane unlocked the Pirates' defense and crossed for Katlehoma Shehu to score. Mawalane's long-range shot came off the post, but Lifatu Tsulupa was there to score the second goal. The Dube Birds completed the turnaround when Lerato Shabangu headed home from the free kick to seal the victory. The Buccaneers have now lost 2 matches in a row after the shock defeat against Maluti FET College in the Nedbank Cup. Mohoki Habonamong's 76-minute strike was enough to end SuperSport United the Tshwane bragging rights against the University of Pretoria. The 2 teams are now level on 24 points on the ABSA Premiership log. Vincent Sitsula, SABC News.
It took 18-year-old Sergil Peterson just 80 sublime minutes to announce himself at Super Rugby level. And now Super Rugby debutants, the Southern Kings, have their hands full having to manage a player who was still at school 4 months ago.
Fresh off the production line at Grey College in Port Elizabeth, straight into the white-hot media spotlight. 2 tries and a man-of-the-match performance against the Force in Port Elizabeth on Saturday have made Peterson hot property. But the Kings are well aware of the possible pitfalls.
We have a good culture in this team, and I think that's very, very important. And the nature of the culture that we have in the team results in the players being grounded. Obviously, a young guy like Sergil, we have to look after him, both from a management perspective and a player perspective. So our senior players assist in that process.
The Kings have a bye this weekend. Solomons has welcomed it because the Kings aren't a complete unit yet, and they need to be when the Sharks visit Port Elizabeth on the 9th of next month.
We know they're going to be strong and tough in front, and we just need to do our work in front at the lineouts and the scrums and planning our week ahead.
The full squad is expected to be fit and available for selection for that match. Yuri Blichnout, SABC News, Port Elizabeth.
And those were your news headlines. Your market news coming up after a short break.
On to your market news now. Most Asian shares rebounded today. They drew enough strength from solid US data and the Federal Reserve's rededication to monetary stimulus to take Italy's political gridlock in stride. But Japan's Nikkei average dropped for the second straight day, a pause in the yen's weakening after an inconclusive Italian election prompted investors to offload currency-sensitive stocks that have outperformed recently. The Nikkei lost 1.3%. Hong Kong shares finished just above a two-month low in choppy trade. The Hang Seng Index closed up 0.33%, and the Shanghai Composite Index rose 0.9%. US stocks ended higher yesterday. They rebounded from their worst decline since November after Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke defended the Fed's bond-buying stimulus and sales of new homes hit a four-and-a-half-year high. The Dow Jones Industrial Average shot up by 0.8%. The Standard & Poor's 500 Index gained 0.6%, and the Nasdaq Composite Index advanced by 0.4%. Well, European markets and the JSE looked as if they were headed for a positive start before trading began, but the JSE started off flat before dwindling early on. Key European markets opened in positive territory today, clawing back on losses made yesterday, apparently inspired by good news coming out of the US of a better-than-expected rise in new home sales, as well as Fed Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke also providing some much-needed relief when he defended the Fed's quantitative easing policies. Let's take a look at the numbers. The FTSE is up by 0.2%, the Paris CAC gained 0.33%, and the German DAX is up 0.2%. The all-share index is 1% lower, industrials and financials 0.9% weaker. The resources index has slipped 1.3%, the gold index 0.33% lower, and the platinum index has slumped 2.4%. Gold is trading at $1,607 an ounce, platinum at $1,606 an ounce, and crude oil is trading at $112.95 a barrel. The rand's trading at 8.83 to the dollar, 13.36 to the pound, and 11.57 against the euro. And so now I'm joined by Chris Gilmore. He's from ABSA Private Clients. Pardon my jumble of words. Welcome, Chris. Chris, Fed Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, he has reiterated his confidence in his stimulus programs. He's indicated that he's aware of some of the pitfalls like higher inflation and asset bubbles bursting and so on and so forth. What did you make of his comments?
I think what he was doing really was coming in and trying to make the markets a little bit more stable after some of the I could only call them the leaked messages that were coming out of the Monetary Policy Committee in the US last week, which suggested, no more, and that's all the markets require, it suggested that the quantitative easing that's been in place now for the past 5 years might start being withdrawn because the US economy looks like it's grudgingly starting to gain a bit of traction. So I think a lot of market participants didn't like that because they've quite liked the idea of having all this QE coming through. So I think what Bernanke did was basically pouring oil on troubled waters to try and reduce expectations that was actually going to happen. Whether in fact it's going to happen or not, I'm not entirely sure. But if you look at what's happening in the US economy right now, you mentioned it earlier, you're seeing better new home sales, the best since 2007. You're starting to see unemployment coming down. The US has got new oil fields like you can't believe. They're going to be the biggest producer in the world by 2017, and with the biggest reserves. So all of a sudden, things are starting to look markedly better for the US economy. So it wouldn't surprise me if they started to start taking some of that QE off as the year progresses. Not right now.
All right. Now, the oil price, that's kind of trended downwards to around the $112 a barrel level. It's good news for the global economy, but why has that happened?
Number of reasons. The demand and supply dynamics at this point in time are pretty much in balance. And we've had a few little supply side scares with South Sudan pipeline and stuff like that, but that's largely a thing of the past. As I mentioned earlier, we're starting to see some new capacity coming on stream in the US. And the only reason it hasn't had a bigger impact up to now is that a lot of that supply is getting gridlocked in the US refinery system. There's so much of it, they can't actually refine it. They can't get it onto the markets. So I think you know, we're looking at a situation now where opinions vary now between those who say yes, demand is going to keep the price up, and others who say yes, but there's an awful lot more supply coming on stream quite shortly now. So there's a possibility, and I put it no stronger than that, that over the next few months we might just see that demand side of the equation coming to the fore and actually helping to reduce prices. And goodness knows we need it here.
Well, I was going to say, for us here at home, on the ground, does it really mean anything, given that the rand is a little bit on the weak side?
Well, you've put your finger on it. Two critical factors here, the rand-dollar exchange rate and the oil price itself, the dollar oil price. If the dollar oil price comes down, and the rand behaves itself, in inverted commas, in other words, it doesn't get an awful lot weaker, then we can look forward to the possibility of some relief on the fuel front. But the rand is the critical factor here. You know, it has been gyrating quite markedly. It's been the worst performing currency in the world this year so far. So if that continues, if the rand continues to weaken, then any benefit that you get from the lower dollar oil price would probably be negated by the weaker rand-dollar exchange rate.
I want us to touch on company results now. Imperial Holdings, they came out with results for the 6 months to December. Headline earnings per share up 14%, revenue up by 18%, and the dividend up a nice 27%. What's your view on that particular stock, and would you put your money there?
Quite like Imperial. You know, under Hubert Brody's leadership, this thing has really come back nicely. It wasn't looking so good 5 years ago. It's looking an awful lot better now. 14% up, as you say, and some of that growth coming out of the rest of Africa, which is quite interesting, because if you look at so many companies in the JSE these days, an awful lot of their growth is now coming out of the rest of the continent rather than South Africa per se. Imperial is what we call a GDP stock. It's intimately linked to what happens in South Africa and in terms of our economy. But, you know, I think they're mindful of that, and they've been trying to get more and more international exposure, and it's paying off. And that was actually quite a good result. Well, I quite like this one.
I have a tough time pronouncing this one, but Grindrod,
you got it there first time.
The freight logistics and shipping services company, they also came out with healthy numbers. Revenue up 60%, headline earnings per share up 22%, and the dividend up at 28%. Your thoughts on that stock?
Yeah, you've got to be careful with this one, because if you strip out what happened with the sale of a ship, they're only up about 12%, in fact. And if you look further into it, the actual real positives were in the port of Maputo, which they're developing, because you know, it's much easier to get a lot of South Africa's commodities to Beira and to Maputo than it is to Richards Bay, because you don't have the rail links. So they're intimately involved in things like that. And so it's more on the logistics side and on the port side. On their traditional business, the actual the shipping side, that is looking very, very sloppy at this point in time. If you look at a thing called the Baltic Dry Index, which is an indication of how much dry, heavy goods are being transported on the deep oceans, that is at one of its lowest level in many, many years. So that's giving an indication there's an oversupply of tonnage on the world's oceans at this point in time. And Grindrod is suffering from that. But on the other side, it's more than compensating for it. So it was actually a good result. And I think once that supply situation on the world's oceans is taken up, is absorbed, then I think Grindrod looks in a much better position.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's all we have time for. That was Chris Gilmore. He's from ABSA Private Clients. Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan is walking a tightrope. After the break, we preview Budget 2013. Do stay with us. when he delivers this year's budget. He has to spend to meet government's obligations, but he's faced with depleting revenues. Well, Devon Murugan is at Parliament ahead of the speech. It's over to you, Devon.
Well, thanks very much, Nompu. It's a scorching heat here in Cape Town as MPs make their way to the National Assembly. Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan will deliver his 2013 budget address in a short while. And as with every budget comes context, and this time around he's delivering this budget while South Africa goes through subdued growth. There's been striking activity in some of the major sectors of the economy, and there's political and social tension. So how will these circumstances really shape what the minister has to say this afternoon? Well, let's speak to the experts and find out. Economist Wilfred Moyo is from Momentum. He joins us now to talk about the budget. Wilfred, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
All right, so here we are faced with a shrinking tax base in South Africa on the one hand. On the other hand, the finance minister has to spend money to meet the government's obligations. It's a tough job, isn't it?
It is. It's definitely a tough job for him. He will have to try and balance the two. Try and get more income, and on the other hand, try and spend wisely, investing in projects that are going to develop employment.
All of this under the backdrop of what the ratings agencies have been saying. We've seen three of them downgrade South Africa, calling for a better fiscal management, a better fiscal path. You look at South Africa's debt, for example, sitting at 35.7%. Not as bad as our European counterparts, but this is something that will feature strong in the budget address today, wouldn't it? The budget deficit and debt levels.
Certainly. I mean, the budget deficit is a critical thing. If the minister balances that act properly, what we're going to see, maybe the rating agencies might give us some time to actually correct that. And I mean, if that doesn't happen, then if we are downgraded, the problem is that interest rates are going to shoot up, and that's going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm. And that really goes to the heart of the consumer. We can see how a decision on top filters down to the bottom. It basically makes the country's borrowing of money costlier, doesn't it?
Exactly, and that will affect the consumer down on the street. I mean, many people forget that our consumers are actually dependent. If you look at the family structures, they are dependent on one or two people who are working. So to balance that act, I mean, the minister will have to try and improve his tax receipts, and by doing that, if he tries and increase that tax rates, it's going to affect the individual working on the street.
Let's talk about wastage, Wilfred. We've seen this time and time again with Pravin Gordhan. He's been warning national and provincial governments to rather take the path of investment spending rather than consumption expenditure. No doubt these warnings will come up again in this budget speech, wouldn't it?
Certainly. I mean, if you look, he came out strongly in the last year's budget talking about wastage. I think it's high time that as a nation we should actually try and identify projects that are meaningful to the country, that are going to bring about, reduce the unemployment levels. And also we need to apply that high level of professionalism within managing the resources of the nation.
I asked the question because just a few weeks ago you had the Auditor General coming out, not a very happy man, speaking about the fact that we used 102 billion rand on consultants in national and provincial government. So this is a big chunk of government money apparently wasted in certain circumstances.
Certainly. I mean, wastage might be a strong word. Sometimes consultants are necessary, but we need to apply our minds in every decision that we take. Sometimes it's unnecessary spend, and we need to curb that and try and apply our minds. Hence the reason why I'm saying we need to have people who have got the nation at heart, people who are going to go all out and try and manage these resources with their heart in the business.
Having said that, we've seen the idea of a chief procurement officer being mentioned before. The finance minister mentioned it in his budget last year. Someone that will oversee corruption, potential corruption, someone that will oversee the issue of tenders. We haven't heard any announcement yet. What do you think will happen today?
We haven't heard, but I think the minister has to come out strongly today. That's my expectation. My key interest is actually in that particular aspect. I'm happy to say that the president hinted in his speech about them trying to curb corruption, but today I actually would like to hear the minister coming in detail and telling us what's going to happen, what are the next steps from here.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. Economist Wilfred Moyer from Momentum, thanks indeed for your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, Nompu, it's back to you in Johannesburg.
Thanks, Devon. The banking sector has rejected a proposal for a credit amnesty for highly indebted consumers. The South African Banking Association says such an amnesty would send the wrong message to them.
The proposal was aimed at people earning 10,000 rand or less a month. The amnesty would cover debt of up to 15,000 rand. Consumers would not be blacklisted anymore, enabling them to qualify for loans. But the Banking Association says this is not the way to deal with consumer debt.
We hear what the DTI is saying, that the intention is not that people don't pay the debt. But we believe that expunging of negative credit information and enabling people who have not been able to manage their debt to get more debt is just counterintuitive.
Kovadia said credit amnesty granted 7 years ago did little to change consumers' attitudes. Banks say consumers need to be more responsible when borrowing.
When a customer takes a loan, he or she has obligations and duties. And we're concerned about the fact that it seems that there's a trend that customers don't have obligations and duties, that lenders or credit providers are the only people who must have duties and obligations, and that's not right.
The Banking Association says the number of people seeking credit is growing amongst those earning above 15,000 rand a month. But with the National Credit Act and the National Credit Regulator firmly in place, the rate of unsecured lending has stabilized over the past 2 years. Asana Mbeche, Business News, Parliament.
Will the Finance Minister hit the pockets of the wealthy? After the break, we cross back to Parliament to find out. Do stay with us. Hour. Let's cross back to Devon at Parliament in Cape Town. He's been talking to analysts ahead of the address. Devon, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Nompu. Indeed, I've been canvassing opinion about what the Finance Minister is likely to say this afternoon. It's just less than an hour before he takes the stand and tells us exactly how he plans to ensure that the government has enough money to pay all the costs for running the social aspects of the government. Now, remember, he's doing this at a time when the economy is very subdued, so there's lesser rands coming into government coffers because of tax revenues being reduced drastically. Well, let's get some response from a tax expert. She's from KPMG, Deborah Tickle. Deborah, thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Afternoon.
Before we talk about whether or not there indeed will be new taxes or tax cuts, let's take a look at government's purse at the moment. Now, the Finance Minister told us in his medium-term budget statement in October that he estimates a collection of 820 billion rand. But when you look at the environment at the moment and when you look at the context, it's not likely that he's going to reach this estimate.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's going to be a shortfall on that, particularly since we've had mining strikes in between, and we are fully aware that a number of the mines experienced losses since then, and those losses translate into reduced tax take.
There's no doubt government has to find a way to get money. The government needs the money to meet its social obligations. Could we see new taxes being introduced, or rates at least, this afternoon?
I think there's a very good possibility that we see an increase in a rate somewhere, be it the VAT, the personal income tax, or the corporate rate. But let's just talk about the personal income tax. Our current marginal rate, which is the highest rate that people pay, is reached at 617,000 Rand. Now, that's at 40%. So it would be very easy for Minister Pravin Gordhan to add a couple of percent at perhaps a higher level. So either an additional bracket or band, or to just simply put that rate up. So I do think there's a very good possibility. The problem with that is that the tax take won't be significant. They maintain that there's around about 100,000 taxpayers that earn income over a million Rand. So if one translates that into an additional tax percentage, then you're around about 6 billion Rand, which certainly isn't going to cover all the shortfalls.
Even if you had room to maneuver ordinary taxes, the VAT, the income tax, you're not going to have a very popular reaction to that, because the country is not doing all that well economically, is it? So people are struggling.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we see inflation, we see the electricity hikes, we see petrol hikes. So obviously an increase in the tax rate would simply add to the burden. But we do generally, in budgets that we have had in the prior years, seen the bracket creep being, what they call bracket creep, being counteracted. And just to explain that for the viewers, bracket creep is where one earns a higher salary, and because of that higher salary they go into a higher tax percentage band. And what Minister Gordhan tends to do is increase the band so that just by earning a higher salary doesn't mean that you're paying a higher percentage. There have been some commentators who've said, well, he could actually solve his problem by simply not moving the bands. And it's not a bad idea, but it would certainly hurt people's pockets.
One idea that's been persistently coming through ahead of this budget is that perhaps the suggestion is the finance minister could increase the measures of compliance, of policing around tax obligations by individuals and companies. And that way, he doesn't broaden the base, but he certainly does ensure that a lot of money does come in and people are obligated to pay the tax. What's your reaction to that?
Yes, I think we've been seeing a much better and much more efficient revenue authority for a number of years now. And in October last year, the new Tax Administration Act was promulgated, and that gives the Revenue Authority a lot of muscle to collect penalties and interest where people have defaulted. That obviously is a form of collection. So there's a tax take in the form of penalties and interest. But obviously, the more people that are earning who pay the tax, the more is collected. So definitely compliance needs to be enforced and that everybody pays their fair share.
Before I let you go, let's talk about corporates. They'll be watching. South Africa is sitting around about 28%. You look at the UK, corporate tax 30%. There is some room to maneuver here. Would he put some taxes on the corporate sector, you think?
It's a possibility, certainly. If one looks at the average rate in Africa, it's 29.02. Corporate rates vary around the world. I mean, you've got in North America around about 20, in Europe an average of about 33, so there's certainly some room for it. But we are looking to try and increase jobs. We're looking for investment from overseas. And even though tax isn't the only factor that investors take into account, it certainly is one of them, and we don't want to push our tax rates to a level where it becomes a less attractive country to come to.
Tax expert from KPMG, Deborah Tickle, thanks indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, Nompu, that's it from me for now. You'll be talking to me a little later as we approach that all-important budget address happening in a few moments. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Devon. More business news coming up after the break. Do stay with us.
Also for this budget addressed by Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan. We're going to talk to socio-economist Pierre Hastien now and get his ideas on what to expect from this budget. Pierre, thanks very much for coming in.
Pleasure.
The government is under pressure to spend for its social obligations. If the uprisings in terms of municipal unrest and social unrest regarding service deliveries, anything to go by. But on the other hand, he has very little money to actually do this because of the shrinking tax base. Do you think this budget will deliver any immediate relief for poor people in South Africa?
I think it may deliver an immediate perception belief. I think there will be increased social spending. I think we may, on the odd chance, see higher taxes on the super rich to try and pass that circulation back to them. But I don't think effectively it's going to make a huge difference or bring a lot of relief. What we need, what creates growth is circulation of money. And we already see that the largest tax base comes from our middle income group. And what we need is to encourage that. And if too much social spending, what we've got is government handing out stuff on one hand while punching the poor with the other. Really what they need to do is in many ways let the economy go and let people be more economically active where they can.
It does help when the consumer watches this and know very well that there's a fuel levy coming up possibly in this budget. 24 hours later we'll have an announcement on the electricity prices. Administered prices are really bringing the consumer down, so this budget will give them an indication what's to happen in the coming year, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I hope to see some respite on those price increases, not necessarily increased government control, but just some investigation on why those prices are so high, looking at competition, looking at efficiencies in the electricity production. I really think that we can handle increased prices, but they need to be justified, and these kind of increases really aren't. There is a fundamental problem, and government should be addressing that rather than handing out more money so that people can afford higher prices.
You speak about handing out more money. 1/3 of the population is on a social grant. We have an unemployed situation here which makes the burden even stronger. But yeah, the key idea is really to create a job and get the jobless into that job, isn't it?
Absolutely. We need to address inequality, but the perception is that you do that by taxing the rich and giving it to the poor. Absolutely not. We need to address inequality by getting the poor and the middle class more active and getting money circulating around so that we can pass wealth and value creation to each other.
If you had to choose one thing you'd like to hear in this budget, what would it be?
I'd like to see a stronger address on skills development and opening up small business administration and the barriers that are really restricting them from taking off.
Thanks very much. Socio-economist Pierre Hastien, thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thanks a lot.
All right, Nompu, I suppose the next time you cross to me, we'll be starting up with our special budget broadcast. That would be on SABC 2 at 2 o'clock. It's back to you.
Thanks very much, Devon. In other news, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke has strongly defended the U.S. central bank's monetary stimulus. This eased financial market worries over a possible early retreat from bond purchases. Bernanke told Congress that Fed policymakers are aware of potential risks from their extraordinary support for the economy, including the possibility that it might fuel unwanted inflation or stoke asset bubbles.
Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke calmed markets, confirming he would continue the Fed's quantitative easing program. He also mollified the concerns about Fed policy after last week's FOMC minutes indicated dissent, rattling the markets, making it clear the central bank was sticking to the plan and will keep buying bonds to support the economy.
These additional purchases of longer-term Treasury securities replace the purchases we were conducting under our now completed maturity extension program, which lengthened the maturity of our securities portfolio without increasing its size.
S&P's David Blitzer says Bernanke's testimony helped the markets regain their footing.
Markets reacted to Bernanke was positive. Prices went up. I think as a result, he really did job number one, which was to get people back on an even keel compared to where we've been since the minutes from the Fed came out last week, but also a lot of the news, the Italian elections, the concern about the outcome or the uncertainty of the outcome in the election.
The Fed chief was also concerned about the automatic spending cuts set to take effect on Friday.
Given the still moderate underlying pace of economic growth, this additional near-term burden on the recovery is significant. Moreover, besides having adverse effects on jobs and incomes, a slower recovery would lead to less actual deficit reduction in the short run for any given set of fiscal actions.
Bernanke warned that while the full impact of the sequestration will not be felt immediately, over time, furloughs and spending cuts would have a substantial and potentially damaging effect.
US President Barack Obama has taken his case for softening the effect of deep budget cuts to Virginia. But there's little sign he'll be able to halt automatic cuts from starting this week. Obama was speaking in front of a huge submarine propeller at the Newport News shipbuilding shipyard. It's where scheduled maintenance to the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln has been delayed due to the budget crisis.
With cuts known as the sequester due to kick in March 1st, there's little sign of progress.
There's a sensible way of doing things, and there's a dumb way of doing things.
Now he's calling on Congress to act.
There are too many Republicans in Congress right now who refuse to compromise even an inch when it comes to closing tax loopholes and special interest tax breaks. And that's what's holding things up right now. Keep in mind, nobody's asking them to raise income tax rates. All we're asking is to consider closing tax loopholes and deductions that the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, said he was willing to do just a few months ago.
Boehner had words for the president.
For 16 months, the president's been traveling all over the country, holding rallies instead of sitting down with Senate leaders in order to try to forge an agreement over there in order to move a bill.
Democrats and Republicans agreed to $85 billion in automatic cuts in 2011 as part of a plan to fix an earlier budget crisis.
Italian leftist leader Pierluigi Bersani faces weeks of tough talks after admitting he had come first but not won Italy's key elections. He's warned that the huge anti-austerity protest vote that left the Italian parliament at an impasse should be heeded beyond Italy's borders. Final results show that while Bersani's coalition won the lower house, no party had taken the upper house. The election was seen as crucial for the Eurozone, which fears that a return to political instability in Italy could send shockwaves across a region still struggling with the debt crisis.
The Eurozone has been largely free of its debt crisis this year, but the Italian election has changed that. There's no majority in the Senate, and control of both houses is needed to govern. Global markets tumbled on the uncertainty, and the mood wasn't much better on the streets of Rome.
This is just not governable. This government cannot govern.
The five-star movement is really anti-European, and he got a lot of votes. That's worrying.
French Finance Minister Pierre Moscovici.
We must respect what the people choose and what's the democratic system of each of our country. But what I hope is that Italy will find a solid, a stable and a reformist government.
Attention has also turned to Spain. Both countries are struggling to create growth and control debt. But Spain's economy minister insists the election hasn't changed anything.
I think that we should not pay too much attention to short-term volatility. I think that at the end of the day, what we have to regard is the medium-term scenario.
The political stalemate is similar to that seen in Greece last year. And like Greece, new elections within a year are now a strong possibility in Italy. Many are wondering about the damage any renewed debt crisis could do in the meantime.
Striking workers of Kenya Airways have reportedly called off a two-day strike after reaching an agreement with management on a pay hike. Flights from its main Nairobi hub were delayed on Friday and Saturday as some 3,000 workers went on strike to press for a 130% pay hike. The pay plan includes, among other things, an interim wage award of 10% for the first year and 10% for the second year, a total of 20% for the review period. The East African nation's industrial court had approved a request this week by the airline stopping its workers from going on strike until the court heard the pay dispute. The airline's flights to the coastal city of Mombasa, Kisumu, Maputo, Dar es Salaam, Addis Ababa and Entebbe were delayed but have now resumed. Let's take a look at the African markets. Let's take a look at the final markets. The all-share index is down 1%. Industrials and financials are lower by 0.9%. The resources index is 1.2% weaker. The gold index has slipped 1/3%, and the platinum index falling 2.3%. The rand's trading at 8.82 against the dollar, 13.37 to the pound, and 11.56 to the euro. The FTSE is 0.25% firmer. The Paris CAC down by 0.4%, and the German DAX has eased 0.1%. So now it's a matter of minutes before Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan delivers his fourth budget speech to the nation. Eagerly waiting at the steps of Parliament is our colleague, Lukanya Kalata. Lukanya, what's the mood ahead of the Finance Minister's speech?
Nampo, good afternoon and welcome to the steps of Parliament. Now, just right behind me is the parliamentary choir that's obviously trying to lift the mood here. I'm sure they can sense that something is not quite right. Well, in just a few minutes, the Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan is expected in the National Assembly, which is just right behind me, to deliver what would be his fourth budget speech. It's expected to be quite a tough and quite a tricky one for the minister if you consider that he delivers this budget at a time when the global economy is on a slight decline. Europe, which is Africa's or South Africa's biggest partner, is not doing so well, especially the Eurozone, and the minister will then deliver a budget. He delivers this budget in that context. Now, we were able to speak to opposition parties a little bit earlier on, and many of them expressed their expectations. I remember when we spoke to COPE a little bit earlier on this week, they said that they wanted the minister to deliver a budget that puts the brakes on unnecessary spending within government. The IFP, for instance, said they want the minister to look at, or they want the government at least to look at changing social policies in South Africa, to go from, to change the South African economy from spending on social matters to spending rather on production issues. So it's going to be quite interesting to hear what the minister is going to elaborate, for instance, on the National Development Plan, which President Jacob Zuma spoke quite a lot about in his State of the Nation address last week. It was also quite well debated within the National Assembly over the last 2 days. So quite interesting, and the minister is expected in the National Assembly within a few minutes. Nompo, back to you.
Thanks very much, Lukanya. That's our reporter, Lukanya Kalata, reporting for us at Parliament steps. Now, Christina's going to give us some weather.
Thank you, Nomfa, and a very good afternoon to you. Well, today we've got a partly cloudy day around the country. Isolated thundershowers, though, expected through the central interior, stretching down to that Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal coastline, with scattered rainfall expected through that central interior regions, with warnings from the Weather Service for humid conditions all the way along that eastern region, all the way up to the coastal and border region with Mozambique. But further south, we're expecting a Veldfire watch in the interior regions of the Eastern Cape, and heatwave warnings still linger through, but those should end today through the eastern regions of the Western Cape. But another humid condition warning for parts of the Northern Cape, and very hot conditions linger through there as well. But a cold front bringing some cooler weather and some wet conditions to the southwestern region of the country. Your temperatures peaking quickly. 35 degrees in Pretoria, 40 in Uppington, mild with that cold front, Cape Town reaching up to 21 degrees. Quick look at tomorrow as that cold front makes its way through. Scattered, widespread and isolated showers expected through the eastern as well as that southwestern region. But that's all from me. Have a great afternoon. Ciao.
Thanks, Christina. That's a wrap from the News at 1 team. Another reminder that Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan delivers his budget speech shortly. You can catch that speech as well as analysis live on SABC2 at 2 o'clock. As for us, we're back again tomorrow. Do take care.
Good afternoon. You're watching a special budget broadcast on SABC2. In a few minutes, Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan will deliver his 2013 budget. All ears will be on the Finance Minister to see what, or rather to hear what he has to say about taxes, about youth employment, the government's infrastructure and development drives to support the economy. Now, there are proposals, there are requests from different sectors of the economy and the political spectrum. If you look at business, they want the Finance Minister to say something positive around a policy, hoping to encourage investments. Labour wants youth employment to get into order. They want support for the youth employment. It will be interesting to see what the Finance Minister has to say there. Remember, we also have a very, very subdued economic growth in South Africa, so the mechanisms and the support that the government has to pick up that subdued growth, all ears will be on what the Finance Minister has to say. It looks as though many of the MPs are getting ready and are settling down ahead of this big speech by the Finance Minister, and in a short while he's sure to make his way to the podium and speak about some of those very, very pressing issues. Now, this budget does come in a climate where we've seen strikes affecting certain economic sectors in the country. We've seen the international economy subdued, and that, of course, has a very dramatic effect on the economy of South Africa. The economy of South Africa not doing as well as it should to create that all-important employment. If you're a consumer, you'll be watching to find out whether or not there are indeed any tax coming your way or tax increases coming your way. The tax experts we spoke to a little earlier on suggest that there may not be a lot of room for those taxes for the Finance Minister to put through, simply because the country is going through a very, very difficult time as far as the consumer is concerned. So that's on the consumer front. I suppose business, again, as I said earlier, will be watching for this budget address to give an indication that policy certainty is on its way. There's the Finance Minister there having a quick chat before he goes up to the podium. Of course, there are other sectors of the economic spectrum that will be watching him. You look at opposition parties wanting him to really give us some flesh on the national development plan. We heard the President speak about it last week or earlier. There's Trevor Manuel there, the former Finance Minister, the Minister of National Planning. It's his plan that many are hoping will get some flesh to it as the Finance Minister delivers his speech this afternoon. Minister of Higher Education there, Bladen Zimande, a very, very important part of this budget, education. And then, of course, Jeremy Cronin also having a few words before we get into that all-important budget address. It's going to be a tough juggling act for the Finance Minister. He will have to reassure the ratings agencies as well that the country is indeed on a sustainable fiscal path. But of course, it's not going to be easy, as I said, given the fact that economic growth is slowing, which affects the government's spurt. There's the President and Deputy President, Kgalema Motlanthe, together with President Jacob Zuma, having a quick chat before the address. We were talking a little earlier about the ratings agencies very concerned about South Africa's debt levels. Now, the country's debt levels are not as bad as those of Portugal, Spain, and some European countries. It's sitting at 35.7%, whereas if you look at a country like Portugal, 119% of its GDP. So South Africa in a fortunate position there, but the ratings agencies are concerned that perhaps South Africa's fiscal path may not be on the right path, looking at its obligations it has to fulfill some spending needs. So much of the speech will actually talk to exactly that. That's what analysts tell us. We seem to be almost ready now. The MPs were standing a few seconds ago. I see they are now seated, which indicates that perhaps the Finance Minister may be on his way to the podium to give the address. Well, I see the MPs are standing. The address looks like it's going or getting underway. Let's take proceedings now in Parliament.
There will now be an opportunity for silent prayer or meditation. Please be seated. Order. The Secretary will read the order of the day.
Introduction, Appropriation Bill, and tabling of the Division of Revenue Bill.
And now I wish to invite the Honourable Minister of Finance, the Honourable Minister.
Honourable Speaker, Mr. President, Mr. Deputy President, fellow Cabinet colleagues and Deputy Ministers, the Governor and Deputy Governors of the Reserve Bank, the MECs of Finance, fellow South Africans, honourable members. Honourable Speaker, I have the honour to present the fourth budget of President Zuma's administration today. Mr. President, you said in the State of the Nation address that, and I quote, "We should put South Africa first. All of us have a patriotic duty and responsibility to build and promote our country." You further said, "The National Development Plan provides a perfect vehicle for united action precisely because it has the support of South Africans across the political and cultural spectrum. Leaders in every avenue should be ready to rise above sectional interests and with great maturity pull together to take this country forward." End of quote. This challenge applies, as you point out, Mr. President, to all sections of our society: business, labor, public representatives, activists, and citizens, more importantly, in every part of the country. As we pointed out in the 2012 budget, global economic certainty will remain with us for some time to come. And honourable members, it is certainly with us, as you've seen from recent ratings decisions around the world. South Africa's economic outlook is improving, but requires that we actively pursue a different trajectory if we are to address the challenges ahead. Under your leadership, Mr. President, we've opened new channels of communication and built more cohesion amongst key stakeholders in South Africa. We have taken many steps to create the conditions for higher levels of confidence in our economy and society. Now, as you pointed out, we are ready to implement the National Development Plan and other programs of government. South Africans have a rich history of acting together for a better future. 30 years ago, when some of us had a bit more hair, ladies and gentlemen, than we had now, the United Democratic Front brought together people of goodwill and foresight from all corners of the country. Many points of view, many differences in approach were marshaled around a single cause: building a united and non-racial society. We did the same for the first democratic elections in 1994, which laid the basis for an enduring democracy. The Reconstruction and Development Program is the foundation on which we build. It said, and I quote, "It is this collective heritage of struggle, these common yearnings, which are our greatest strength." At the same time, the challenges facing South Africa are enormous. Only a comprehensive approach to harnessing the resources of our country can we reverse the crisis created by apartheid. Only an all-round effort to harness the life experience, skills, energies, and aspirations of the people can lay the basis for a new South Africa, end of quote. The schools, clinics, taps, and houses we have built and put in place since then are testimony to the truths of these assertions. The freedom and democracy we cherish and the knowledge that these are permanent, inalienable rights grounded in our basic law, the Constitution, are the foundation on which all South Africans can make a contribution. Looking back on the path we have traveled since 1994, we see the importance of a long-term perspective on development and change. It is people acting together for a common vision that connects the past to the present and makes a better future possible. The challenge for us, honourable members, and indeed all of us in South Africa, is that people are asking if we can sustain our miracle. They are asking whether we as a nation have the ability, the will, and the wisdom to take another leap forward in reconstructing and developing South Africa. They are asking whether South Africans can still show the world how to overcome intractable problems that face the community of nations. In these trying times, South Africans too ask the question, can we be a winning nation? The answer surely must be, of course we can. As Benedict Mongalo, a young man from Johannesburg, is one of the tipsters, writes in his tip, and I quote, "We all acknowledge that unemployment, poverty, and inequality are the greatest challenges facing our country. We will not eradicate this problem overnight. This is like manually moving a mountain, and the only way to do it is to move one rock aside, and the next generation or next government will do the same until this mountain is moved," end of quote. Wise words from a young man. Hope and confidence come from energetic involvement and a willingness to make a direct contribution to change. The imperatives of change are not just challenges to government, they confront all of society. A new framework for development is an opportunity to unite around an inclusive vision and join hands in constructing a shared future. The National Planning Commission has cautioned that our development objectives will take time and hard work to achieve. Measured year by year, district by district, there will be advances and indeed there will be setbacks. But in each 5-year term of government, we must demonstrate, as we have since 1994, that we can meet more demanding milestones, more jobs, more enterprises, more technological innovation, better housing, and progress in education and health. Working together, we all know that we can do better. All of us, citizens, taxpayers, public servants, teachers, activists, managers, and workers, we all have a shared future, and we have a shared plan to make it work. The 2013 budget, Mr. Speaker, and forgive me for coughing every now and again, is presented in challenging times, but against the background of a new strategic framework for growth and development. This is a budget in which there is limited room for expansion, yet there are significant opportunities for change. There are firstly signs of improvement in the world economy, though the outlook remains troubled, and it's more than likely that they will remain troubled for the next 3 to 5 years, if not beyond that. South Africa's economy has continued to grow, but at a slower rate than projected at the time of the 2012 budget. The 2013 budget takes the National Development Plan and other programs of government as a starting point or point of departure. The strategic plans of government and the medium-term expenditure plans will be aligned to realize our objectives. Government has taken measures to control growth in spending. Spending plans have been reduced by some 10.4 billion rands through reprioritization, savings, and a drawdown on the contingency reserve. Government remains committed to a large-scale infrastructure investment program, and our path of spending and the recovery in revenue will stabilize debt at just higher than 40% of GDP. The budget deficit will fall from 5.2% in 2012-2013 to 3.1% in 2015-2016. A review will be initiated this year of our tax policy framework and its role in supporting the objectives of inclusive growth, employment, development, and fiscal sustainability. In the 2013-14 fiscal year, personal income tax relief of some 7 billion rands is granted. A new local government equitable share formula is proposed, providing a subsidy for free basic services designed to reach 59% of households in South Africa. Further education and training, Minister Nzimande, will continue to be extended and enhanced. In this budget, we continue to invest in education, health, housing, public transport, and social development, components of the social wage which add up to 60% of public expenditure. As part of a package of measures aimed at boosting opportunities for young work seekers, government recognizes the need to share the costs of expanding job opportunities with the private sector. And following careful consideration of inputs from various stakeholders, a revised youth employment incentive will be tabled in the House after consultation with various stakeholders, together with a proposed employment incentive for special economic zones. In this regard, I want to quote from page 23 of the budget review. Government's existing approach to supporting employment growth focuses on training, skills development, labor market activation, and short-term public employment. Programs in support of these objectives include sector education and training authorities, further education and training colleges, small enterprise support, the Industrial Policy Action Plan, the Expanded Public Works Program, and the Community Work Program. To complement existing programs, a tax incentive aimed at encouraging firms to employ young work seekers will be tabled for consideration by Parliament. The introduction of this tax incentive, which takes into account the concerns of organized labor, will help young people enter the labor market, gain valuable experience, and access career opportunities. The administratively simple incentive will create a graduated tax incentive at the entry-level wage, falling to zero when the earnings reach the personal income tax threshold. Protection provided by existing labor legislation, combined with oversight by the South African Revenue Service and the Department of Labor, will limit any displacement that might arise. A similar tax incentive will be made available to eligible workers of all ages within the special economic zones. Let us for a moment reflect on the global situation. There are signs of improvement in the world economy, though the outlook remains troubled, as I pointed out earlier. Growth is still muted in the United States and Japan, and much of Europe is in recession. Policy interventions by major central banks were needed during 2012 to avert new economic and fiscal crises. Yet many advanced economies contracted, reduced growth during the fourth quarter of 2012, and global prospects are expected to improve only marginally from growth of 3.2% in 2012 to 3.5% in 2013. Emerging markets, particularly China and India, continue to lead global growth, although at lower rates than before. High levels of debt are inhibiting progress in many countries, particularly in the developed world, yet measures to reduce indebtedness have the effect of holding back growth. Unemployment remains high in many countries, developed and developing, yet technological progress continues to reduce the demand for labor in many industries. Around the world, inequality is fueling discontent. So there are parallels, honourable members, between the global economic discourse on the one hand and our own policy challenges in seeking a pragmatic balance between recovery and consolidation, between economic power and social solidarity, between infrastructure investment and human development, between encouraging enterprise and regulating markets, and we are grappling with these issues that confront many other nations today. As far as the South African economy is concerned, our economy has continued to grow, and so in that sense we're fairly good, but at a slower rate, as I pointed out earlier, projected at the time of the 2012 budget as a GDP growth of 2.5% in 2012, and is expected to grow at 2.7% in 2013 and 3.8% in 2015. But these are just forecasts. They can be right, there can be more optimism around them, there could be more pessimism, depending on how the rest of the year develops. Inflation has remained moderate, with consumer prices rising by 5.7% in 2012 and projected to increase by an average of 5.5% a year over the period ahead. Our trade performance needs to be better. Exports grew by just 1.1% in real terms last year, while imports increased by 7.2%. The deficit on the current account of the balance of payments was 6.1% of GDP. This means, in simple terms, that expenditure in the South African economy exceeded the value of production and income in the South African economy by 190 billion rands last year. So that's the gap we have in our economy. That's the gap we need to fill in by people investing in this country, either in shares, in bonds, or in the real economy itself. This is partly a consequence of the disruption of mining sector activity and the structural reduction in mineral exports due to lower demand elsewhere in the world. Some of the foundations of faster growth are indeed in place: strong capital investment by the public sector, the addition of electricity generating capacity, relatively stable inflation, and the low interest rates will support improved growth rates over the medium term. But this is not enough. Much more is needed. In particular, a significant increase in private sector investment and competitiveness is needed in the wider economy, in agriculture, in manufacturing, in tourism, in communications. Every sector has to play its part in expanding trade, investment, and job creation. The National Development Plan, supported by the New Growth Path and other programs, invites us to look beyond the constraints of the present to the transformation imperatives of the next 20 or 30 years. These imperatives are already apparent in the realities of the social and economic restructuring that is underway. The first reality is our demographic transition. 1 million young people leave school every year, and we need a package of reforms and measures that will improve education, training, and work opportunities for young people. The second is that we are a rapidly urbanizing society. This means we need to meet urgent demands for housing, municipal services, schools, clinics, public transport, and commercial development. But it also means that we have an opportunity to build an integrated urban landscape with effective partnerships between municipalities, local businesses, and civic associations. A third imperative, honourable members, is economic competitiveness. We need to invest in infrastructure, raise the productivity, and diversify our economy to create jobs and raise living standards. Improving the quality of education and training is an essential foundation of a more productive and inclusive growth path. Stronger links with Africa and other emerging economies are needed. We have to adapt to a low-carbon economy, including mobilization of a renewable energy potential. And finally, there is the social solidarity challenge that cuts across all of these. which is to build a more equal and inclusive economy that bridges our racial and other divides. These are the themes on which the NDP provides clear guidance, not just about strategic goals and objectives, but also about the practical difficulties and choices we face. There are substantial strengths on which to build: a well-established legal system, secure property rights, an effective tax system, world-class higher education institutions and science councils, established energy, transport, water, communications and infrastructure networks, all of which will improve with the PICC programs that are coming into place. We have expertise and capacity in many areas in South Africa: mining, construction, retail, finance, logistics, and manufactured exports, and a sound macroeconomic and fiscal framework to support all of this. So those are the strengths we have. We mustn't feel that because we have challenges, we have no strengths in our economy and in our people that we can build upon. The NDP emphasizes key institutional capabilities that we either need to create or have: the need to professionalize the public service and strengthen accountability, improved management and enforcement systems to fight corruption more aggressively, reinforcement of the education accountability chain with lines of responsibility from state to classroom. So we wish Minister Motseka success in monitoring attendance of teachers at schools. Improved planning and management of strategic infrastructure projects, which government is executing through the PICC. The NDP also highlights the need to lower the cost of living for households and to reduce the cost of doing business for small and emerging enterprises. Let me also reiterate the NDP's emphasis on uniting South Africans around a common vision. It proposes a social compact to reduce poverty and inequality and raise employment and investment, recognizing that progress towards a more equal society requires shared efforts across the public and the private sector and from all South Africans. And so the 2013 budget takes the NDP as its point of departure. It recognizes that our medium-term plans, as the President pointed out, are framed in the context of a longer-term vision and strategy. It focuses on strengthening growth and employment creation. It prioritizes improvement in education and expansion of training opportunities. It promotes progress towards a more equal society and an inclusive growth path. Mr. Speaker, national development must also be coupled with fiscal sustainability, which ensures that the progress we make will not be interrupted or reversed. The government relies on resources derived from the wider economy, and the best way to generate resources or tax revenues is to grow the economy faster and increase the tax base. That means all of you must pay a little bit more tax. Thank you very much. I'm coming to that in a moment.
Order.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP targets an annual growth rate of more than 5% a year. This would double the resources available to government in the next 2 decades. The present reality is that growth is more modest. The economic turbulence we experienced in the second half of last year has resulted in a revenue shortfall amounting to 16.3 billion rands potentially. The deficit is now estimated to be 5.2% of GDP, as opposed to 4.8% as we thought in October, in 2012-13. The growth outlook for the next 3 years has weakened, and government's net debt is now expected to stabilize marginally higher than 40% of GDP, but still at a sustainable level. In the medium-term budget policy statement, we noted that if the economic environment were to deteriorate, government would reassess its revenue and spending plans to secure South Africa's fiscal footing. In the circumstances, our approach involves several elements, which I will outline. Additional measures to control spending, reducing real expenditure growth to an average of 2.3% over the next 3 years, compared to 2.9% that we signaled in October 2012. A reduction in the budget deficit to 3.1% by 2015-16, a level consistent with the stabilization of debt. Steps to reinforce growth, building on the competitiveness enhancement program introduced last year. Initiation of a tax policy review. A review committee will be established, ladies and gentlemen and honorable members, which will be chaired by Judge Dennis Davis. Other names will be added later. A comprehensive review of expenditure, focusing on both spending controls and value for money in government programs and agencies, strengthening the capacity of the state to implement our plans and programs. All of this, honorable members, indicates to you and indeed to the South African public that President Zuma's government and cabinet is capable and does take tough decisions when they're required to be taken. And here's an example of that. Government is committed to remaining within the expenditure ceiling set out in the budget. New policy initiatives over the next 3 years will be financed from savings, efficiency gains, and reprioritization. No extra money. Structural increases in spending require corresponding revenue increases if they are to be financed sustainably. If we succeed in driving growth towards 5% a year, and government revenues doubles in the next 20 years, major infrastructure projects and new policy initiatives such as the National Health Insurance Program and expanded vocational education will be affordable with limited adjustments to tax policy. But if growth continues along the present trajectory, substantial spending commitments would require significant adjustments in revenue and reductions in other areas of spending. In other words, taxes could go up later. On Parliament's request, the National Treasury has prepared a report that considers fiscal sustainability from a long-term perspective. The report is currently being considered within government, after which it will be tabled for Parliament's consideration. In growing the real economy, honourable members, it means that growing the real economy means expanding business activity and other relevant economic activity. We recognize the key role that the private companies and other enterprises play in our economy. In the lead up to the budget, we engaged with several business leaders on the investment and development challenges we face in South Africa. Allow me to share with you some of their plans, which signals growing confidence in the business outlook despite the difficult conditions that we face. And here are a few examples. Construction and refurbishment by a company in the hospitality sector of about 2.5 billion rands in the next 18 months, and the expansion of 3 billion rands in the pipeline. 2 telecommunications investments amounting to 14 billion rands this year. Capital expenditure of 3.4 billion rands over the next 3 years by a rail and logistics operator. A 2.5 billion rand expansion and longer-term plans of 15 billion rands in mining projects. Investments of 14 billion rands this year by a leading retailer and plans to open 100 new stores by another. An expansion of 1.2 billion rands this year by a food and beverage sector firm. Plans for some 28 billion rands in long-term infrastructure investment by a leading industrial company, which will create 10,000 temporary and 4,000 permanent jobs. In recent times, the world has become a more uncertain place for businesses, causing some to build cash reserves, both here in South Africa and outside of South Africa, rather than invest in new or expanding operations. As government, we wish to encourage businesses to keep investing in our economy and seize the opportunities around us. We are therefore reinforcing several initiatives that support business development. The Manufacturing Competitiveness Enhancement Program, MSEP as it is called, announced in 2012, has received a total of 215 applications with requests for grants totaling 2.3 billion rands, mainly from the chemicals, metals, and agro-processing sectors. Applications are expected to increase over the period ahead, and funding of 1.7 billion rands per year has been provided on the budget of the Department of Trade and Industry. The Special Economic Zone program also announced last year, has received funding to build world-class industrial parks. We are in discussion with Minister Davies. Go ahead, clap. We need a bit of a break. We are in discussion with Minister Davies on specific tax incentives to enhance this initiative. The Jobs Fund, announced in 2011, has concluded 2 calls for proposals. 3,600 applications have been received. 65 projects are on their way, and grant funding of some 3.3 billion rands has been approved, matched by a further 3.1 billion rands from the private sector. So it's 6 billion rands commitments in all. Small and medium and micro enterprises play a key role in the development of the economy and are a significant generator of employment. Financing of SMMEs has been simplified with the creation of the Small Enterprise Finance Agency by Minister Patel. We have been progressively working to simplify the tax requirements for small businesses, and you'll hear some of it later. The turnover threshold will be increased this year, and the graduated rate of structure will be revised as well. Africa, ladies and gentlemen and honorable members, is our home, and indeed it is our future. It is a market of over 1 billion people, and it is growing rapidly, far more rapidly than South Africa. The National Development Plan acknowledges the global shift of economic power from west to east and highlights the rise of Africa. Indeed, we have already begun to see our trade patterns shift from traditional partners in Europe and the United States to new markets in Asia and Africa. Africa now accounts for about 18% of our total exports and nearly a quarter of our manufactured exports, although largely in SADC. Over the past 5 years, the South African Reserve Bank has approved nearly 1,000 large investments into 36 African countries. These are mutually beneficial as they support development in those countries, and also they generate tax revenue, dividends, and jobs both abroad as well as in South Africa. To further support the private sector in expanding operations in Africa, I will announce simpler rules that will reduce the time and cost of doing business in Africa. A number of measures are proposed to relax cross-border financial regulations and tax requirements on companies, making it easier for banks and other financial institutions to invest and operate in other countries. Similar measures will apply to foreign companies wanting to invest in African countries using South Africa as their regional headquarters. The outward... Go for it, go for it. The outward investment reforms that apply as part of the Gateway to Africa reforms will also pertain to those companies seeking to invest in countries outside Africa, including the BRICS countries. In addition, substantial direct investments in regional developments are underway. We are helping to build infrastructure that will create opportunities for South African companies to expand their trade and investment across the border. The DBSA, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, is accelerating investment in the SADC region. We are supporting infrastructure projects in multiple countries, particularly in the key areas of electricity generation and transmission, and in strengthening road links in the region. Investment by the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation, in 41 projects across 17 countries totaled some 6.2 billion rands in 2012. The bulk of these projects are in mining, industrial infrastructure, agro-processing, and tourism. As part of its long-term strategy to help secure energy supply for South Africa and the region, Eskom is considering options for investment in several regional generation and transmission projects. Next month, honorable members, the President will host the 5th annual BRICS Summit, which brings together Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The summit will unveil the work we have been doing with our BRICS partners on the following, amongst other projects. The possible establishment, indeed the probable establishment, of a BRICS-led bank is intended to mobilize domestic savings and co-funding infrastructure in developing regions. The pooling of members' foreign exchange reserves with a view to using them to support each other at times of balance of payments or currency crises. Collectively, BRICS countries hold reserves totaling $4.5 trillion US. Work is underway. Our colleague is trying to work out the knots. Work is underway on creating a trade and development insurance risk pool. The aim is to establish a sustainable and alternative insurance and reinsurance network for the BRICS countries. These are but a few examples. My other colleagues in Cabinet are working on a lot more other projects. We are reminded that South Africa needs to invest in a strong network of economic infrastructure designed to support the country's medium and long-term social objectives. Over the next 3 years, 827 billion rands is planned to be spent by the fiscus and state-owned companies to build infrastructure. The financing for these projects is in place and is not affected by any of the spending cuts in this budget. The fiscus has allocated just under 430 million rands over the next 3 years for schools, hospitals, clinics, dams, water and electricity distribution networks, electrification of over 1 million new homes, sanitation schemes, building more courtrooms and prisons, and improved bus, commuter, rail and road links. Most of the spending falls under the provinces and municipalities. Eskom, Transnet and other state-owned companies fund a further 400 billion rands of projects. This will be financed both through their own resources and additional borrowing over the next 3 years, supported in some instances, and in most instances, by Treasury guarantees. This will pay for the ongoing building of power generation plants and new transmission lines, investment in rail, ports, pipelines, large new water transfer schemes, and various airport upgrades. Of course, we are well aware that there are parts of government that struggle to spend their full infrastructure budgets. It is important to bear in mind that spending programs have become more ambitious, funding levels have increased, and pressure to deliver has intensified. Records show that government's ability to spend has been steadily rising from year to year. But we all know that it is not good enough. On this challenge, Willie du Preez, a South African, expresses concern about whether infrastructure investment is actually taking place. He suggests, and I quote, "As a citizen, one should be able to obtain from the Treasury website at the end of each financial year what amount was spent on what infrastructure." End of quote. Mr. du Preez, you can already obtain that information from the Treasury website, not just every year, but every month. And I'm sure that as the PICC process advances, that structure will be able to offer more information as well. Our urban areas make a vital contribution to the national economy, honourable members, hosting factories and offices and many work opportunities, and will always be attractive to young people seeking a better life. It is little surprise then that the census 2011 shows that 62% of South Africans are now living in our cities and towns, and that the population of some municipalities grew by over 50% between 2001 and 2011 in 10 years. The challenge we face of highly inefficient, segregated and exclusionary divides between towns and townships impose costs not only on the economy and the fiscus, but also on workers, on families and communities. A new formula for the local government equitable share will be introduced in 2013-14 that recognizes the need to better differentiate assistance to different municipalities, including those in rural areas particularly. Municipal infrastructure grants will also be realigned and go hand in hand with the more integrated planning of new developments so that we can make meaningful strides in overcoming the spatial inequalities of the past. The development plan and our own commitments to the climate change process further calls on government to send a signal to industry and consumers that at the rate of 120 rands per ton of CO2 equivalent, that's very techno jargon, effective from 1 January industries. An updated carbon tax paper will be published for further consultations by the end of March 2013. To ensure that South Africa produces fuel that is more environmentally friendly, support mechanisms for both biofuel production and the upgrade of oil refineries to cleaner fuel standards will be introduced. In addition, government continues to direct spending towards environmental programs such as installing solar water geysers, procuring renewable energy, low-carbon public transport. I see Minister Molewa has got a new car. I hope she lends it to us sometimes. Cleaning up derelict mines, addressing acid mine drainage, supporting our national parks, and in particular, to saving our rhino population, which remains under threat. We are also encouraging the private sector and smaller public entities to be creative and develop low-carbon projects through the Green Fund. In the first call of proposals, 590 applications were received. The 800 million rands that was previously allocated is to be topped up with an additional 300 million rands. The National Development Plan recognizes that reducing the cost of living is essential for broadening economic participation and eliminating poverty. Alongside the economic wage, as we call it, that is earned through work, the social wage provided by government is a steadily rising contribution to improving the living conditions of working people and their families. Substantial growth in social spending over the past decade has financed a threefold increase in the number of people receiving social grants, doubling in per capita health spending, construction of 1.5 million free homes, and the provision of free basic education to the poorest 60% of learners. The impact is evident in improved living standards, expanded access to basic services, and the changing landscape of both urban and rural areas. Mr. Speaker, the social assistance budget has increased by an average of 11% a year since 2008-2009, in part due to the extension of the child support grant to the age of 18. Spending on social assistance will rise to 120 billion rands next year. The old age grant and disability grants will increase in April from 1,200 rands a month to 1,260 rands a month. The foster care grant will increase from 770 rands to 800 rands a month. And the child support grant will increase to 290 rands in April and 300 rands a month in October. It is also proposed that the old age grant means test should be phased out by 2016, accompanied by offsetting revisions to the secondary and tertiary rebates that's in the income tax system. All citizens over a designated age will be eligible for the grant, which will simplify its administration and address the disincentive to save that arises from the present means test. Alongside social assistance, access to health care is a vital element in the social wage. There has been progress in reducing mortality and improving our HIV and TB programs, and an expansion in medical and nursing training capacity is underway under the very tough hand of Minister Motsoaledi. Pilot national health insurance projects have been initiated this year in 10 districts and will include improvements to health facilities, contracting with general practitioners, and financial management reforms. A new conditional grant is introduced this year to enable the National Department of Health to play a greater role in coordinating these reforms. The initial phase of NHI development will not place new revenue demands on the fiscus. Over the longer term, however, it is anticipated that a tax increase, I'm going to say will be needed, it might be needed, I hope. The National Treasury is working with the Department of Health to examine the funding arrangements and the system reforms required for NHI. A discussion paper inviting public comment on various options will be published later this year. Government's contribution to housing and basic municipal services is a substantial component of the social wage. The budget for housing and community amenities has increased by over 16% a year since 2008. Progress continues to be made in extending access to housing, electricity, water, sanitation, and refuse removal services. The main contribution of the national budget to the financing of household amenities is the local government equitable share. A new equitable share formula, as I indicated earlier, is proposed in this budget, which will provide a subsidy of 275 rands for every household with a monthly income less than 2,300 rands, or about, as I pointed out earlier, 59% of all households. We also recognize that many businesses provide their employees with housing assistance or housing loans. However, the current fringe benefit tax is unduly burdensome in cases where an employer transfers a house to a low-income worker at a price below market value. Tax relief is proposed to address this difficulty and make this process less expensive. Mr. Speaker, the social wage complements employment earnings and contributes to a more equitable and inclusive economic growth path. National health insurance and further steps in social security reform will also reinforce social solidarity and the decent work agenda. Social spending, however, is not a substitute for job creation and for people having jobs. One of our most because we must all agree, as the President has indicated on many occasions, that all able-bodied persons in South Africa should have a job, should have the dignity of a job, should have the security of income, and have at the same time. We know that that is not going to happen tomorrow morning. So the social wage plays an important, very important, supportive role to our communities. One of our most pressing development challenges is to expand work opportunities for young people, as I indicated earlier. There has been extensive debate on how this should be done, and the answer is a wide range of measures, as I indicated earlier as well, that include further education training, public employment opportunities, and support for job creation in the private sector. To complement these existing programs, and I'm repeating this just so that you understand it, a tax incentive aimed at sharing the costs of employing young work seekers will be tabled for consideration by Parliament so that the private sector and government can share costs. It will help young people enter the labour market to gain valuable experience and access career opportunities. A similar incentive, as I pointed out, is proposed for eligible workers of all ages within the intended special economic zones. In last year's budget, Mr. Speaker, I indicated the need for South African households to save more. I am now able to announce the following proposals for consultation before we introduce the necessary legislation this year. Tax-preferred savings and investment accounts will be introduced in 2015. There has been a lot of research work done in this area. Retirement funds will be required to identify appropriate preservation funds for exiting members who will be encouraged to preserve when changing jobs, means keep your retirement funding safe so that you can actually enjoy your retirement on your own savings. Retirement funds will be required to guide their members through the process of converting savings into a regular income, what people would call an annuity, after retirement, and to choose or establish default annuity products that meet appropriate principles and standards. More competition will be promoted by allowing providers other than life officers to sell living annuities. The tax treatment of pension, provident and retirement, with measures in place to ensure that trustees of funds are trained once they have been appointed. I intend to call a conference of all trustees this year to take this process further. We are also considering how to encourage all employers to provide appropriate retirement mechanisms for their employees as part of the broader social security reforms. In implementing these reforms, the vested rights of current members of retirement funds will be protected. Let me take this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to confirm that the Government Employees Pension Fund has remained fully funded despite the turmoil in financial markets in recent years. A 6% increase in civil service pensions will be effected in April this year. That's for retirees. There has been rapid growth in unsecured credit in recent years. The share of new mortgage lending has fallen rapidly and is now less than or almost equal to both new vehicle credit and new personal loans. We will engage with the banking sector to explore how to increase the level and share of new mortgage loans. Small business financing must also be supported to a far greater extent than is currently being done. We are concerned by the abuse of emolument attachment orders that has left many workers without money to live on after they have serviced their debts every month. We are in discussion with the National Credit Regulator, the Department of Justice, and banks to ensure that the lending market remedies its behavior. In the meanwhile, all employers, including the public sector, can play a role and assist their workers to manage their finances and to interrogate all emolument attachments, or garnishee orders as they're called, to ensure that they have been properly issued. I also call on the various law societies, and I'm sure the Minister of Justice will help me in this regard, to take action against members who abuse the system. Now, the important part where you have to pay more tax. Mr. Speaker, allow me now to turn to the revenue or tax proposals. We find ourselves in a challenging period, as I indicated, with revenues lower than expected by probably 16.3 billion rands compared with the estimates at the time of the 2012 budget a year ago. This is predominantly due to weak economic growth during the second half of the disruptions that we've seen in the mining sector and lower commodity prices because of the structural reasons I outlined earlier. Tax revenues are expected to improve over the medium term in line with higher economic growth and the stabilization of key commodity prices. Over the past decade, we have steadily, both through policy reforms and improved revenue administration. This has made substantial tax relief possible. My predecessor used to be sometimes Father Christmas in February, giving tax breaks to everybody in the years gone by, contributing both to household disposable income and a lower cost of doing business. The main tax proposals for 2013 are as follows. So the good news is there's no tax increases. In fact, we give personal income tax relief of 7 billion rands to remove most of the fiscal drag, together with adjustments for the medical tax credit and other monetary thresholds amounting to about 350 million rands. Reforms to the tax treatment of contributions to retirement savings you will find in the details. An employment incentive, as I pointed out, through the tax system, which has to be registered through Parliament because it has to be part of the budget process. Further tax relief for small businesses, including an increase in the monetary tax thresholds applicable for small business corporations. This will give them some relief. An overall increase of 23 cents per litre on fuel levies in April, which includes 8 cents per litre for the Road Accident Fund levy. That's the part you won't like. Increases in excise duties on alcohol and tobacco products of between 5.7% and 10%. And the introduction, as I pointed out earlier, of carbon tax in 2015, together with the phasing out of the electricity levy. So your pack of cigarettes or can of beer is going to cost marginally more, ladies and gentlemen. A tax review will be initiated this year to assess our tax policy framework, as I pointed out, and its role in supporting the objectives of inclusive growth, employment, and development, and above all, fiscal sustainability will be looked at. The budget review outlines various measures proposed to protect the tax base and limit the scope for tax leakage and avoidance. The taxation of trusts will come under review in order to control some of the abuse that goes on at present. Modifications are proposed to the tax treatment of employment share schemes and disability or income protection policies. Outstanding difficulties in the distinction between debt and equity will be addressed, and it is proposed that foreign businesses which sell e-books, music, or other digital goods and services to South Africans should be required to register as VAT vendors in line with our VAT regulations. These are the same provisions that have been adopted by the European Union and other jurisdictions across the world. On tax administration, Mr. Speaker, millions of honest taxpayers in our country continue to sustain our growth and development agenda. It is, as I remind you, often their money that we spend and talk about today. To them, we owe a debt of gratitude, and more importantly, a commitment to spend that money wisely, efficiently, and effectively. Let us give a loud and joint thank you to all tax-compliant citizens in South Africa. Anybody who's feeling guilty about not paying their fair share can see Commissioner Makashula later on. We also owe it to our taxpayers to ensure they are not carrying the burden of those who benefit from our country's infrastructure and resources without paying their fair share of costs. Around the world, taxpayers and their governments are challenging large multinational companies that pay little or no tax in the countries in which they operate and profit from. Meeting in Moscow earlier this month, finance ministers and central bank governors of the G20 countries were united in supporting an overhaul of international company tax rules to address this issue. The South African Revenue Service is currently engaging with companies that have their base operations in South Africa, means they operate here, they make their money here, they make their profits here, but appear to have shifted a large proportion of their profits to low-tax jurisdictions where only a few people are employed and very little tax is paid in South Africa. This is unacceptable. SARS is also pursuing schemes identified under the revised General Anti-Avoidance Rules following several years of painstaking work tracing transactions through multiple jurisdictions and entities. These benefits typically accrue to advisors and pre-existing shareholders rather than new shareholders who were introduced as the ostensible beneficiaries of these transactions. So these are all schemes that require very careful attention. Honourable members will remember a temporary voluntary disclosure program was implemented under legislation enacted in 2010, which allowed taxpayers in default to regularize their tax affairs. More than 18,000 taxpayers have made use of this program, and tax of more than 3 billion rands has so far been collected as a result of this program. Minister Sakwala had a special request for me this morning that I shouldn't praise any of these people because they were dodging tax. From 1 October 2012, a permanent voluntary disclosure program became effective as part of the Tax Administration Act. Some 700 taxpayers have already come forward. Tax of more than 200 million rands will be collected before the end of March 2013. SARS is also targeting other areas of non-compliance, including recipients of government expenditure who are not up to date with their taxes. Put it more simply, people get tenders and contracts from the state, but they don't pay tax to the state. Treasury and interfacing with government department payment schemes SARS has identified companies who have received payments but have not declared their full income tax. They are being audited and others will follow. So we do have sufficiently developed systems, honourable members, which allows us to know who received how much from the state. We are now sending auditors to all of them, or as many of them as possible, and saying, show us that you've paid your fair share of tax. This intervention will be further underpinned by the reform of the tax clearance certificate process, which I announced in October. In the near future, SARS will introduce a single registration process in which companies are able to register once in a simple manner for all tax types and customs activities. On this, we can perhaps consider adding the suggestion by Amanda Hayes, who runs a small business in Cape Town. She proposes that a single database of suppliers to government be created out of all the companies that apply to SARS for tax clearance certificates. In addition to reducing the burden on small businesses, Amanda says this database will help reduce corruption because of the tighter national oversight over companies who are registered on this database. Thank you for your suggestion. Mr. Speaker, I have indicated many of the specific programs and activities of government that contribute to our growth and social development objectives. Allow me to summarize the framework within which these allocations are made. The 2013 budget provides for continued real growth in spending to support service delivery and to expand investment in infrastructure. It will also accommodate the costs of the 3-year public service wage agreement signed last year. In the past, we have been able to add substantially to medium-term spending plans during the budget, but this year is different. Money has been taken away from certain programs that are not performing or are not aligned to government's core priorities and given to programs that are delivering as planned. The main appropriation provides for 1,055 billion rands in expenditure next year, rising to 1.2 trillion rands in 2015-16. Debt service costs, that is the interest that we pay on our debt, will come to 100 billion rands next year, and 4 billion rands is set aside as a contingency reserve. This leaves 951 billion rands to be divided between national, provincial, and local spheres. National departments are allocated 47.6% of available funds in 2013-14. Provinces are allocated 43.5%, mainly for education, health, and social welfare. Local government receives 8.9%, primarily for providing basic services to low-income households. Allocations from the contingency reserve will be made later in the year, mainly for unforeseeable and unavoidable expenditure. Work is in progress to determine funding requirements for reconstruction and rehabilitation following flood damages in Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga. An allocation will be made in the adjustments appropriation for Dinaledi School's connectivity program and other broadband infrastructure projects subject to finalization of implementation plans. The equitable division of revenue between provinces and municipalities takes into account the 2011 census, which shows that substantial shifts in distribution and age structure of the population since 2001. Changes to provincial and municipal allocations will be phased in over a period of time to avoid disruption of services. The provincial equitable share amounts to 338 billion rands in 13-14, and conditional grants to provinces will total 77 billion rands. Additional allocations have been made to increase employment of social workers and to provide additional support to non-governmental organizations which provide critical welfare services. There's additional funding for teachers in the poorest 20% of schools and grade R classes and for the community library services. Provinces are also funded for an expansion in HIV and AIDS programs and an improved TB diagnosis system. Infrastructure transfers to provinces have increased sharply in recent years, growing from 4.8 billion rands in 05-06 to 39.7 billion rands in 12-13. To improve the quality of spending, The application process for infrastructure grants is being revised. Provinces will be required to submit building plans 2 years ahead of implementation and will only receive allocations if plans meet certain benchmarks. A total of 85 billion rands is allocated for transfer to municipalities in 13-14, rising to 101 billion rands in 15-16. Additional allocations are made for municipal water infrastructure, public transport, and integrated city development. Mr. Speaker, there's a considerable amount of detail in the budget review and the estimates of national expenditure, the thickest book that you see here, on government spending plans and service delivery targets. I will highlight just a few points. Consolidated government expenditure is budgeted to increase by 8.1% a year, from 1.1 trillion to 1.3 trillion in 2015-16, but still within the parameters that I outlined earlier on. Allocations for employment programs increases by 13.5% a year over the next 3 years. There will be higher funding for employment projects of non-governmental organizations and for working for fisheries. Minister Jumat Peterson, do we see a smile? The expanded public works program aims to support 684,000 full-time equivalent jobs in 13-14. Additional allocations are made for the sheltered employment factories of the Department of Labor and to support the work of the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration. Consolidated spending on health and social protection is 268 billion rands in the coming year. Health infrastructure remains a priority. In 2012, a total of 1,900 health facilities and 49 nursing colleges were in different stages of planning, construction, and refurbishment. Substantial improvements in the social assistance payment systems are in progress, providing easier access for recipients to their grants. The cost of social grants payments has been reduced from 32 rands to 16 rands per disbursement. Thank you, Minister Dlamini. Spending on education, sport, and culture will amount to 233 billion rands in 13-14. Over the period ahead, the basic education sector will focus on improving numeracy and literacy, expanding enrollment in grade R, and reducing school infrastructure backlogs. Together with the broader education infrastructure grant, some 24 billion rands is available to provincial education departments for infrastructure over the next 3 years. But they must spend that money. 700 million rands has been allocated over the MTEF period for the Technical Secondary Schools Recapitalization Grant. This will finance construction and refurbishment of 259 workshops and training of over 1,500 technology teachers. Transfers to higher education institutions increased from some 20.4 billion rands this year to 24.6 billion rands in 15-16. The total number of students enrolled in higher education institutions is expected to increase from 910,000 currently to 990,000 in 2015. Funding has been allocated for the construction of new universities in the Northern Cape and in Mpumalanga to commence this year, as Minister Nzimande has announced earlier. Expenditure on economic services in 2013-14 will amount to 48 billion rands, including 5.3 billion rands for the Manufacturing Competitiveness Enhancement Program and the 2.9 billion rands for special economic zones. Additional allocations include 450 million rands over 3 years to the Economic Development Department for the Small Enterprise Finance Agency. The Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries will continue its support for smallholder farmers. Additional funding goes to the Department of Mineral Resources to support beneficiation and rehabilitate derelict and ownerless mines. The allocation to the Department of Science and Technology includes 2 billion rands to support the Square Kilometre Array project. Expenditure on transport, energy and communications will amount to some 89 billion rands next year. The allocations to the Department of Transport increases from 42 billion rands next year to 53 billion rands in 15-16. reflecting increased allocations to the Passenger Rail Agency for its rolling stock procurement program, and further investment in the national road network. Additional funding goes to the integrated public transport networks in urban areas and for provincial road maintenance. The Integrated National Electrification Grant is allocated additional funding to increase the number of new electricity connections by some 645,000 over the next 3 years. The solar water geyser program will be continued until 15-16, and Centec will receive 599 million over the medium term for the migration from analog to digital terrestrial television. Local government, community amenities and housing are allocated 132 billion rands in 13-14. The largest increases go to bulk water, water treatment and water distribution projects, and allocations to the local government equitable share. 4.3 billion rands is allocated to a new grant administered by the Department of Water Affairs, providing for water treatment, distribution, demand management, and support for rural municipalities. The Municipal Infrastructure Support Agency of the Department of Cooperative Governance receives 820 million rands to provide technical assistance to rural and low-capacity municipalities. Funding for improving human settlements will grow from 26.2 billion rands to some 30.5 billion rands over the next 3 years, including 1 billion rands to support the informal settlement upgrading program in mining towns. Social housing receives an additional allocation of 685 million rands. The General Public Services function is allocated 57 billion rands. This includes the SARS budget of some 9 billion rands, which is just over 1% of revenue to be collected. So the cost of collecting all of those billions of rands is just 1%. Other agencies must start emulating that. The Department of Public Works reprioritized 464 million rands over the medium term to fund its my scroller is moving too fast. Its turnaround strategy with focuses on lease and property management. The Public Service Commission received 71 million rands to combat corruption and address grievances. Over the MTEF period, the Department of Home Affairs will spend 1 billion rands on its information systems modernization program, which has already led to substantial reductions in time required to produce official documents. Congratulations, Minister Pandor. The allocations for defense, public order and safety amount to 154 billion rands in 2013-14. Provision is made for peacekeeping operations in the Central African Republic, where 400 Defence Force personnel have been deployed. The Department of Police has reprioritized 2.5 billion rands over the 3 years to improve detective and forensic capability. The Department of Justice and Constitutional Development receives 1.2 billion rands for criminal justice sector revamp and a modernization program. There is increased funding. Minister Hadebe is not happy. There is increased funding allocated to the National Prosecuting Authority for the Tutuzela care centers. The Public Protector of South Africa receives funding to increase its investigative capacity, and additional funds, you better match them on this side. Additional funds are also made available to Legal Aid South Africa and the Human Rights Commission. Mr. Speaker, last year I said to this House that we will continually endeavour to increase the value which government receives for money it spends. Let us be frank, let me be frank. This is a very difficult task, with too many points of resistance around the country. However, we have registered some progress. In the present system, procurement transactions take place in too many localities and the contracts are too short term. Consequently, there are hundreds of thousands of transactions from a multitude of centres across the country. There is very little visibility of these transactions. While our ablest civil servants have had great difficulty in optimizing procurement, this process has yielded rich pickings for those who seek to exploit it. There are also too many people who have a stake in keeping the system the way it is. Our solutions hitherto have not matched the size and the complexity of the challenge. As much as I want, I cannot simply wave a magic wand to make these problems disappear. This is going to take a special effort from all of us in government, assisted by people in business and broader society, including the ladies and gentlemen on my left. And it will take time, but we are determined to make progress. The process for setting up the Chief Procurement Office and officer is in place, and the National Treasury has deployed a senior DDG to this position, Mr. Kenneth Brown. We've been given seconded personnel from the private sector to assist us in this unit, and work is well on its way. A project team seconded from the state agencies and the private sector, as I mentioned, has identified 4 main streams of work involving immediate remedial actions, improving the current system, standardizing the procurement of critical items, what we call transversal contracts, and the long-term modernization of the entire system. Amongst the first initiatives of this office will be to enhance the existing system of price referencing. This will set fair value prices for certain goods and services. Some of the system already exists, some will be added on. Secondly, it will pilot procurement transformation programs, and I want to thank the ministers in this regard in the Departments of Health and Public Works nationally and in the provinces. National Treasury is currently scrutinizing 76 business entities with contracts worth 8.4 billion rands, which we believe have infringed procurement rules. While SARS is currently auditing more than 300 business entities and scrutinizing another 700 entities. The value of these contracts is estimated at over 10 billion rands. So far, 216 cases have been finalized, resulting in assessments amounting to over 480 million rands being raised. The Financial Intelligence Center has referred some 6.5 billion rands worth of transactions for investigation linked to corrupt activities. I fully support Minister Sisuru's call for appropriate curbs on officials doing business with government. I will compliment her initiative by aligning the Public Finance Management Act with the provisions of the Public Service Act. Worldwide, special measures are being taken to oversee the accounts of what have become known as politically exposed persons, public representatives and senior officials. I've asked that the FIC, the Financial Intelligence Center, should explore how we might bring South Africa into line with these international anti-corruption and anti-money laundering standards. Mr. Speaker, taxpayers and indeed all South Africans are understandably impatient for tangible change. A recurring theme in the tips sent to me for this budget was to ensure value for money. Peter Maibelo, age 24, from Pretoria, Tshwane, summed it up as follows, and I quote, "Minister, I won't be fancy with words or complicated ideas. My advice for a healthy, sustainable fiscus is to brutally eradicate corruption. Then we will be honored to pay taxes." Mr. Maibelo, while we're cleaning up the system, please continue paying your taxes. Rooting out corruption requires, as I pointed out earlier, collective effort from all of us. In concluding, Mr. Speaker, my sincere appreciation goes to President Zuma and Deputy President Motlanthe for their guidance and support throughout this year. It's been a difficult economic year. My appreciation also goes to colleagues of the Ministers' Committee on Budget for their continuous and vigorous engagement with the challenges that we face and their bold and steadfast advice. I want to, above all, thank my Cabinet colleagues who collectively own this budget. Their support and understanding for tough measures, including taking head cuts and haircuts, is highly appreciated. A heartfelt thank you to Deputy Minister Nene whose vigilant participation and sound advice is invaluable at all times. Thanks to the MECs of Finance, who play a critical role as guardians of some 43% of our collective spending. They have a heavy responsibility. In addition, our appreciation goes to Governor Marcus and the Deputy Governors of the South African Reserve Bank for their constructive management of monetary policy, to Commissioner Opa Makashula and the staff of the Revenue Service for their diligent contribution to fiscal stability. I hope better times return for them soon and they give us more money. The Financial and Fiscal Commission and its acting chairperson, Mr. Kumalo, for their contributions to the budget process, Mr. Jabu Maleketi, chair of the DBSA, and its brand new CEO, Mr. Dlamini, who are positioning the DBSA to make a greater contribution to infrastructure development. To the chair, Mr. Ngubane, and the CEO, Mr. Hadebe, of the Land Bank, and Mr. Hadebe in particular for his illustrious service to the bank. His turnaround strategy really worked. The leadership of the PIC, the Financial Services Board, the Financial Intelligence Center, the Government Pension Administration Agency, thanks to all of you for running a good show. The Managing Director of NEDLAC, Mr. Smith, and the constituency representatives for their engagements with Treasury, which I hope will continue to improve. The Honorable Taba Mufamadi and Cheryl De Beer, who chair the Standing and Select Committees on Finance respectively, and the chairpersons of the Appropriations Committees, the Honorable Sogoni and Chane, who ensure that Parliament remains a vibrant forum for engagement and participation. To our Director General, Lungisa Fuzile and Mrs. Fuzile, for his professionalism, his frankness, and profound commitment to building credible institutions and advancing government's objectives. To the rest of the management and staff of the National Treasury, whose extraordinary contributions and caring for a better South Africa enhances our country's standing in all international fora. I think they produced all these documents. To my Chief of Staff, Mr. Mokhajane, and the Ministry staff for their enthusiastic support, and to my family for making my contribution possible. And finally, I must express sincere gratitude to South Africans from all walks and parts of South Africa who offer words of encouragement and assurance, as well as critiques and concerns. This is what keeps us accountable and drives us to constantly improve our performance as government. Thank you. So forgive the long presentation, but this is just to remind you on what we said for about an hour and a half. There are signs that the global economy is improving. However, uncertainty remains, and the events around us certainly suggest they're going to remain for some time. Future growth, South Africa's economy must grow faster, and it must grow more inclusively. There's no other alternative for us. Future growth is also dependent on private sector investment in the economy. They must do their share to contribute to growth in South Africa. The National Development Plan will be implemented by government together with other plans, and budgets will be aligned accordingly. Government continues to invest significantly in infrastructure and will continue to do so. We are taking additional steps to create opportunities for young people. By this time next year, let us say that we now actually have implemented schemes. Reduced revenue results in less spending in the years ahead unless the economy grows. There are new opportunities to be seized in Africa and other emerging markets. Let's energize ourselves to seize them. We are committed to reviewing and assessing our tax policy framework and its role in supporting the objectives of inclusive growth, employment, development, and fiscal sustainability. A new local government formula benefits significantly rural municipalities. Honourable Speaker, I hereby table before the House this afternoon the budget speech, the Budget Review 2013, the Division of Revenue Bill tabled in terms of Section 10(1) of the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Act, the Appropriation Bill, the estimates of national expenditure. Those are all the documents that lie in front of me, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Speaker, I table this budget in the hope that as a nation, as the President said, we will be able to rise above our own interests. And as you said, Mr. President, prevail with greater maturity, pull together and take this country forward. We have said that South Africa is changing. Indeed, it has changed since 1994. Let us work together to ensure that tomorrow will be better than today. In conclusion, let me remind this House of what former President Nelson Mandela said, and I quote, "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we led." Thank you very much.
If it wasn't for the Air Force Base, I don't know what would have happened.